All right, so thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'll be talking about methodological questions in multimodal research, and that was after consulting with Rania what topic might be suitable, and we chose this rather than a content topic, because Rania suggested that this might actually be of interest for this forum. The case study that I will be looking at is investigating the question, what counts as a relevant gesture in the study of multimodal event expressions. Sorry, I'm still fiddling here. Here we go. No, nothing is working. Great. So the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people in particular, on whose land I live, and also the Bunurong people on whose land Monash University is located. This is an overview of the seminar. You will see that most of this is actually the background section. So I'm trying to give you an idea of how I got into this question, my meandering path, how I ended up doing gesture research, but also background because I'm coming from a particular area in linguistics that not everybody is necessarily sharing before we then get into the case study. So background, first of all, why talk about methodology? Gesture studies is really a crossroads of many disciplines, right? We have people come from cognitive science, from neuroscience, from education, from psychology, first language acquisition, second language acquisition, and in my case, actually, sorry, conversation analysis, all kinds of corners. I'm actually coming from core structural linguistic grammar, description, and so forth. And it means we all come with very different methodological background and different methodological and background assumptions. And there is a high risk that we cross purposes, that I assume background knowledge that is not there, or that I assume something is given that you will find questionable. So there's a risk of miscommunication. But on the other hand, it's really a field that is so tremendously exciting because it's this meeting point of different disciplines. So the potential of gesture studies to get us into an area where we may actually be able to address related or the same research questions from different corners with different methodology is incredibly powerful. But we need to be quite overt about our methodologies and spell them out and share them. And I think methodologies are worth discussing in seminars, are worth publishing about, rather than just having footnotes or little methodology sections when we talk about the content of our research. So we need to talk about methodologies. Rania mentions I'm actually quite new at gesture research. So a few years, 3 years maybe, I have done active gesture research. So quite similar to early career researchers or somebody who's doing a PhD in gesture research. I'm new and feeling my way around, which means often I feel, like a half-informed idiot because it's all so much and so new and I have so many questions. But it's also potentially quite a powerful position because I can ask questions. I don't have to be embarrassed because I'm new, I have questions, and I can put them on the table. So as long as we're aware of, we need to find out about methodology as newcomers, that can actually be a positive, productive position to be in, I hope. So my own background, I'm actually coming from fieldwork-based grammatical description and analysis. I have done work mainly on a language called Salibalogea, an oceanic language spoken in Papua New Guinea. My thesis way back was on valence and transitivity, so hardcore grammatical clause structure, structural questions. And my research has been mainly in typology, but I've also been engaged in documentation of endangered languages, in particular Salibalogea. So there are initiatives, in my case, the Documentation of Endangered Languages program by the VW Foundation, that have funded research on endangered languages, research and mainly documentation projects. The idea is to create lasting records that should have value for the community of speakers and their descendants, and for researchers to safeguard and showcase language and culture of a community. And this is in the context of, if we assume we have about 6,000 languages spoken in the world today, the vast majority of them are highly endangered and will disappear over the coming years, which means we have this, this database of languages on which, in theory, we want to do research about language and cognition. What's the nature of human language? Very big questions, but we're actually losing the diversity of languages to explore this with. So this is, in a way, one of the most pressing problems in any language science, and more generally cultures, because through globalization we lose diversity in languages and cultures. We want to know what is a possible or not a possible human language. We can't just look at English, Cantonese, and a few other Asian and European languages. We have seen again and again how small, less described languages bring up things in linguistic structure that is totally mind-boggling compared to what it was received wisdom based on more researched languages. So this is incredibly important. That's why we have these research initiatives. I was involved in a project here which created a record of recordings. The briefing was, if possible, video recordings, minimally audio recordings, and we compiled a corpus together with a community of about 30 hours of annotated text that is transcribed, translated, and then a large part of that also morphologically and grammatically analyzed. This is based on about a year's worth of field work being in Papua New Guinea, distributed over several years, and many months, or probably many years, annotation of that data. So in this context, first of all, showing you where we all are. Most of you are in Hong Kong, up there on the map. I'm down in Melbourne, and the research with the Saliba-Logia community was in Papua New Guinea. You see here on the map that the islands of Saliba and Logea are located just off the main coast of New Guinea here. And I do want to acknowledge the importance of the Saliba community to this research, but also just to my life. I'm incredibly grateful that I had the opportunity to go and live and visit there, and that people had the patience and the generosity of dealing with me and hosting me and explaining things to me and sharing their language with me. It has probably been the single most important, no, one of the single most important things in my life. And I don't mean that what I have done has great importance, but more that for my life, it has been very important what I've learned from people and the perspective I have on the world, and obviously also on linguistic research, and what I take as normal is now not just based on my native language or in English, but I draw on knowledge of this language and some other language. Okay, background in terms of where I come from. I have worked mainly on Saliba-Logea and kept coming back to research that looked at the encoding of events. So how certain events are encoded in language. And I kept coming back to the category, if you want, of events with three participants. Examples of that would be events of giving or putting or bringing or sending. So three participants here would be, I give you a presentation, I am a participant, you're a participant, the presentation would be the third participant. So participant in that sense. These events are often expressed by ditransitive verbs in languages, but many languages do not use transitive verbs, but quite different constructions. I got into this because Saliba-Logea does very interesting things with give verbs that I haven't seen anywhere else in the languages of the world. This triggered my interest in this. Then done grammar-based research, where I looked at oceanic languages based on reference grammars and looked at grammatical descriptions and the type of constructions these languages have to express three participant events, giving and bringing and taking and putting. And we find a range of constructions, including serial verb constructions and various other things that we may not be familiar with from European languages. And then the following project looked at this cross-linguistically, where we had a sample of basically any language we could get our hands on to take stock of the type of constructions. This is all just speech, so no multimodality here yet. Grammar-based research is interesting and great. What it can never give us is an idea of frequency and what's normal. It gives us an inventory. The language has these constructions that it can draw on. It doesn't tell us which constructions people prefer or regularly use. So corpus-based research can actually give us that type of information. So based on the corpus data I had compiled for Saliba Logea, and then in collaboration with colleagues who have also done documentation of endangered languages, creating corpora, we have done a project looking at texts where people talk about daily life, traditional practices, natural conversations, storytelling, and we used the corpus data to research how certain events are expressed, and corpus data can give us an idea of frequency, what's normal, what's rare, what's absent in a data corpus. We then zoomed in on, from this group of 3 participant events, more specifically on events of bringing and taking. And out of this project, we had an article in Studies in Language and then an edited volume with John Benjamins looking at different languages, most of them small, endangered, actually all of them. We had one chapter per language giving a profile of how this language expresses these events. And the initial chapter by Helwig et al. Gives a typology of this is what we found in terms of constructions and types of expressions of bringing and taking events in the spoken language data. And we found that there was an interesting interaction between lexical semantics, so the verb meaning, morphosyntax, the construction in which the verbs occur, the types of clauses, but also pragmatics, in the sense that some languages explicitly encode certain information in the verb, while other languages might just infer them or apply them through context. So lexical semantics, morphosyntax, and pragmatics, great. But then the question came up, how about gesture? How does gesture contribute to this, to this mosaic of how meaning is expressed, how different aspects of events are expressed? So it was kind of became the elephant in the room. And we then, so that's actually how I got into gesture research over the last years, on the back of knowing my way around a bit about how this stuff works in spoken language, now adding gesture as a different modality. So this gets us into the realm of gesture and linguistic typology and very important studies on multimodal event expression, especially on motion events, first and foremost by Kita and Özerek, and then many other language studies following them that is based on Talmi's typology of motion events. And then there is also research somewhat less and less languages covered, notably by Gulberg and Fuhrmann and their co-authors on caused motion events. These studies are pretty much all stimuli based. So they make recordings. Typically people watch videos which are designed to include certain events and stimulate people to talk about the events that are under study, which gives us a kind of a tailored corpus of spoken and gestured descriptions that make sure that these events are represented in the data. Most of these are still studies on European languages, but for motion events, we have a broader spread, and notably Kita and Özerek, obviously Japanese and Turkish in that original study. So our study then looking at bring and take events, so a type of caused motion, it's a particularly caused accompanied motion, I'll come back to that, is somewhat different from the studies that already exist, in that we work with corpus data that was not recorded for the purpose of our study. It was corpus data, just people talking about the world and life. We then have to search for these type of events in that corpus data. because it was not, we didn't work with stimuli, we actually worked with data that already existed. And also our data sample is quite different in that we have 2 underdescribed oceanic languages and English in the project that we set out to do on multimodal event expression. I now have to introduce you to my collaborators who are co-authors in a study that I will get into eventually. So there's Eleanor Jorgensen from the University of Melbourne, Isabel Burke at Monash University, and Harriet Shepard at the University of the South Pacific. And I also want to acknowledge the data corpora. We worked with the Australian National Corpus and the documentation of Endangered Languages archive material. So it's very important to acknowledge the infrastructure that actually hosts data that we can work with. So we work with existing corpora for Saliba, the language of my expertise, and then Sudest, which is based on fieldwork by Harriet Shepard, and then the Australian English National Corpus that was pre-existing and somebody else collected. So we're talking about bringing and taking events. We can't use the label bringing and taking events from now on, so to speak, because they always come with the baggage of the meta language English. Bring has certain semantic features that, for example, deictics towards the deictic center, but also a lack of specificity in terms of the manner of caused motion. There are many languages that do not have verbs of that exact semantic composition. In fact, there are many languages that don't have bring verbs, and you need to use 2 clauses to express the concept of bring. So that's why we move now to the notion of caused accompanied motion to replace the English labels bring and take. The definition we've been working with is we find an event of caused accompanied motion when we have an entity that causes another entity to move and it moves along a path by acting on it while moving along the same path. What this means is we have this little man here carrying the bag to the recycling bin, and the bag and the little man share the same motion path. So that's what we mean by accompanied motion. So we have a bunch of different semantic bits, features that are relevant here: the agent, the theme, that's what we call the moved entity, the notion of path, the notion of manner of caused motion, the notion of goal, and actually some others. We had the text corpus that we had already coded for bringing taking events in the spoken language. We had identified these events in the text corpora. We coded the event type and the construction. We then added coding of co-speech representational gestures. And so we chose to only zoom in on representational gestures. And what we mean by that is gestures that convey information about the content of the spoken event expression. So we excluded what we considered pure beat gestures, which don't have particular shape that we could code as meaningful beyond maybe a rhythm. We also excluded pragmatic gestures that may represent more the shape of the discourse structure rather than the content of the discourse. So that's how we narrowed our the kind of gestures we were annotating and dealing with. We identified the phases of the gesture and worked with the stroke and hold phase. We then coded the gesture meaning in terms of these meaning components that are relevant for caused accompanied motion events, path, manner, caused motion, and so forth. We then identified exactly what bits of speech did align with the stroke and hold phase, and again coded that for the meaning components that were expressed by exactly the overlapping speech in terms of path, manner, caused motion, and so forth. So that's the annotation we were adding to the corpus data to then do our analysis. What we were aiming for are research questions along these lines. We're interested in the integration of speech and gesture, what semantic features are expressed in speech and or gesture, how they are timed. We're interested specifically in correlations between the semantics and morphosyntax of the spoken language, and whether and how information is expressed in gesture. So this is the same type of research question that we find in previous research that I cited. And we are particularly interested in cross-linguistic differences. So we know that languages of the world may differ in various ways in their expression of bringing and taking events. So our little figure here carrying the bag of recycling, one could describe that as she brought the bag. Another language might describe it literally as she carried the bag hither, or another language might say she took the bag and came. So the questions are there differences correlating with these speech differences in the gesture? One of the things we're interested in are the kind of semantics expressed by gesture. We have an example here from the Saliba corpus where a speaker was talking about a bringing event with a gesture of this type, where we learned something about the manner of caused motion. We know it wasn't thrown or dragged, it was handled. We might have an idea of the type of the entity. So this is not, I don't know, a biro or I don't know, a bottle. It might be a bowl, or yeah, it's not a cup. Exactly, thanks, Rachel. It tells us something. Well, another gesture here also about a taking event is really just an away gesture. It just gives us path information, no information about the theme or the manner of caused motion. So these are the kind of things that we are interested in. That's what we want to publish about However, we kind of, first of all, stumbled into a methodological question. And that's what I'm talking about here today. We talked about our methodology with colleagues who had quite related research questions. Also looking at get verbs, so also caused motion. And it turned out we assumed we would look at all gestures co-occurring with what we considered the spoken event expression. So if I say something like grandma brought pizza to the party, if that is my spoken event expression, our starting point was that we assumed we would code any gesture, representational gesture, that occurred with this. But it turns out there are studies in the literature on very related things, and we talked in particular to Rebecca Defina and colleagues, and there is an approach where one might only look at gestures that occur with the verb and not with the rest of the event expression. So grandma brought pizza to the party, maybe only verbs that temporally align with the bring verb. Once we got into this question, we then realized, of course, there are also other studies that define their gesture inclusion, so the gestures that they are worried about in a study, semantically. So only looking at gestures that express manner, regardless of where they occur in the event expression. And the fourth type of approach that is also discussed in the literature would be one where one might only look at gestures where only at those gestures which align with an element in speech that has that expresses a related meaning. So temporal co-occurrence with a semantic similarity. That was interesting to get into. The question we then have is, does it make a difference? So we have to choose an approach. What might the impact be of the decision that we make on the study that we are conducting? So the short answer is it totally depends on our research question. So we have to think, what are the questions we're exploring? Which of these approaches are most fitting? They're all good approaches. They all make sense, but we were wondering how different the data set would look that we create by following one of these definitions rather than another. So we then formulated these as conditions and looked at our data in with these different filters, basically. So we created 4 data sets. One would be all the gestures occurring with the overall event expression. We called this condition 1. The second one was only the gestures co-occurring with the verb. Condition 3 was only gestures which express a certain type of meaning. And for our purpose, we made this semantic feature caused motion. So we only looked at gestures expressing caused motion. And condition 4 was only gestures that co-occur with co-expressive speech. And so rather than doing what we thought we would do, publish a study on the interaction of speech and gesture, we're still working on that, that's coming. We actually published a study of this methodological question, and that came out this year in the journal Gesture. As I say, I think it's very important that we are explicit and about methodology and make that a topic of exchange. So, does it make a difference which definition we choose? Here is an example, and I have to apologize, I'm not giving you any video examples, but I thought Zoom is complicated enough. I didn't want to have video going wrong on top of this. So here's an example. The event expression was something like, there, bring it to the other side, which is just the homestead from our English corpus. Don't know what they brought here, but there are 2 gestures. One was aligned with bring it to the other, and the second gesture was aligned with the noun phrase homestead. So under condition 1, we would include both gestures in our data sample that we then analyze. Under condition 2, we would only include the first gesture because it aligns temporally with the verb. Condition 3, the first gesture was one that expressed caused motion. So in condition 3, we would only include this first gesture because that's defined by gestures expressing caused motion, which was not the case for gesture 2, which was just kind of giving kind of the boundary or location of the homestead. And under condition 4, again, we would include both gestures because they're both gestures aligned with some element in speech that share the same type of meaning component. So this is an example. It makes a difference how many and which gestures are included. Why is this interesting? Because the data sets we get on which our analysis then is based, may give us quite different results. Obviously, they give us different numbers of gestures we analyze, but what we didn't know was whether it gives us different types of gestures and therefore skewing the analysis of meaning and meaning alignment or meanings that co-occur because the definition of which gestures we included impacted that. So that was an important question. Does the semantic inventory of what is expressed by gesture gets affected by condition choice? And I think this is a very important question more generally in that when we do our own research, in this case, our study, but also if we just read studies in the literature, which studies can we actually compare? Can we compare studies that have basically condition 1 versus condition 2? Or do we have to assume that they really do very different things? And do studies tell us exactly what they've done in terms of their gesture inclusion? And always the question that we are following up is also, are there language-specific differences and different impact by the condition choice? So we were convinced it was interesting. That was the reason why we then conducted this test. So the gestures captured under the different conditions. We looked at the impact of condition choice on the number of captured gestures. More interestingly, on the semantic makeup of the captured gestures, so the meaning components represented in the set we work with in the end, but also the ratio of meaning components per gesture. So as we've seen in the example earlier, we had a gesture of moving something, and we would have coded that as including path, but also caused motion and maybe information about the theme. Well, this gesture we would have coded as only expressing path, but not the other meaning components that might be possible. And so we looked at the ratio of how many meaning components are expressed by a single gesture on average, and how is that impacted by condition choice. So number of gestures, I'd say don't worry about the table, but have a look at the graph. This is all 3 languages together. Condition 1, so each bar is one condition. Condition 1 is the red bar. This is all the gestures that occur within our overall event expression. So that's actually the total set. Conditions 2, 3, and 4 are always subset of condition 1. We can see that, you know, the green bar is only gestures aligned with the verb. The magenta bar is the one only gestures expressing caused motion, and the purple one is the similar meaning or a related meaning at the same time. We then looked at this also language by language and saw that the language saw different sensitivities to the condition choice. So let's explore that. Saliba and Sudest are both oceanic languages quite closely related, and they pattern very similarly here. We find here that in condition 2, that is the green bar, you see that English speakers less often align gestures with the verb than the oceanic speakers. So we find the green bar is shorter for English. We also find significant differences in condition 3, and that means the English speakers used fewer gestures that express caused motion than oceanic speakers. And I won't have time to get into this, but this clearly correlates with the semantics of the verbs that these languages typically use. And then condition 4, we find that English speakers are less likely or less often align their gestures with co-expressive speech than the oceanic speakers, but the difference here is not quite as strong. We then looked at the semantic makeup, and I think that's the more important part maybe, because if we skew by condition choice, if we skew what type of semantic components we actually capture in our gesture data set, that may have a major impact on our analysis. So now we're looking at not gestures as tokens, but meaning component as tokens. And you have to keep in mind that a gesture may have several meaning components. So this is kind of artificially pulling apart something that might happen in a single gesture. We're looking at semantic components such as path, theme, caused motion, manner, and so forth. So let me walk you through this graph. We now have each bar representing one condition. So the right graph here is condition 1, which is all our gestures. Condition 2, the gestures occurring with the verb. Condition 3, only gestures which occur, which express caused motion. And then condition 4, only gestures which temporally align with co-expressive speech. The colors are the different meaning components. So we asked, do all conditions, all definitions of gesture inclusion capture the same range of meaning components? And we can say overall, yes. It's not that, you know, in one bar we have only red and beige, and another bar we only have green. So we find the same colors represented. There is some difference in the frequency maybe, but overall the main meaning components, the top 5 seem to be all represented. Agent and source gestures are not represented under condition 3, but we have so few of them that we can really ignore them rather than considering that a main difference. So overall, we capture the same type of meanings. If we break this down by language, so now we have a set of 3 graphs of 3 bars representing one condition. So this block here is condition 1. Each bar represents one of the languages. This is English. This is Saliba, this is Sudest. You have the legend down here. So condition 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here we find that in the statistical comparison, I should say, we only compared English and Saliba because Sudest is a smaller corpus and the token numbers got so small that we decided to statistically only look at English and Saliba. We find between conditions 1, 2, and 4, the ones that are not framed, significant differences between the languages in terms of how many path gestures are included under condition 1 in English versus Saliba versus Sudest, or how many theme gestures were included in English versus in Saliba versus in Sudest. So we find condition 1, 2, and 3 significant differences. Condition 1, 2, and 4. Condition 3, we do not find significant differences. So differences that are in the data are actually neutralized when we only look at gestures that express caused motion. It doesn't mean they don't express other things as well, but all of the gestures express caused motion. And what neutralizes the differences here seems to be that caused motion as a meaning component tends to be combined with certain other meaning components and tends to be not combined with other meaning components. And so it's a more homogeneous data set than is actually represented in the overall corpus. Then the third thing we looked at, and that's the last bit that we compared, was the ratio of meaning components per gesture. As I mentioned, we can have, my slides are not working again. Now, here we go. So first of all, we looked at all languages combined. We can see that we have here at the bottom a different ratio of how many meanings we have per gesture. This is obviously abstracted. Under condition 1, across the 3 languages, we have just under 2 meaning components per gesture. Condition 2 similarly, condition 4 similarly. Under caused motion, condition 3, we have a much higher ratio. So caused motion seems to typically be combined with other meaning components rather than, more commonly so than gestures on average. So if we look at this language by language, we can see that English overall has, in all of the conditions, a lower ratio of meanings per gesture. So the English speakers seem to have less meaning components expressed in their gestures compared to the oceanic languages that seem to have more, you want semantically complex gestures, if that makes sense as a label. And we also found that English has a higher range, so a higher difference of, so the range is the comparison between the lowest ratio in condition 1 and the highest ratio under condition 3. So the range here in English is 1.3 compared to Saliba, which is somewhat lower, which means the English data in terms of the representation of how many meaning components we have per gesture, the English data is more sensitive to condition choice, so shows a greater variability, reacts more to condition choice than the oceanic languages. So, conclusions of what we got out of this study. If we first of all look at all 3 languages combined, we can say that the conditions render data sets of different sizes, no surprise. But we can see if we compare the sizes of the different conditions, it tells us something about the languages. So over half of gestures temporally align with the verb, that's condition 2. Less than half of gestures express caused motion, condition 3. And the majorities of gestures temporally align with co-expressive speech. So these are our cross-linguistic trends that hold across the 3 languages. When we then look at the capture of meanings, we found that conditions 1, 3, and 4 I think it's 1, 2, and 4. I think it's a typo. We find significant differences in the frequency of certain meanings. But we found robust trends overall, namely that there are certain types of meaning which are the most common. And that is regardless of condition, path, theme, manner of caused motion. These 3 are the most common, and the 3 together across the languages covered 87 to 94% of all the gesture meaning components that were expressed in the data. Conditions 2 and 4, we find relatively little difference in the semantic profile and semantic makeup compared to condition 1, which, to remind you, condition 1 is all our gestures anywhere in the event expression. So conditions 2 and 4 give us, in a way, a good snapshot. It's not significantly different. And it doesn't skew the semantic makeup compared to condition 1. But conditions 3 is significantly different. We find there are more caused motion gestures. Duh, obviously, that's how they're defined, right? So it's semantically defined. But the flow-on effect is that caused motion as a meaning tends to be combined with other meaning components. And we find in this condition a much lower proportion of path or goal gestures. So we don't find caused motion commonly combined with path and goal. And that corresponds to findings we had in the earlier project when we just looked at speech, that some languages do not like to combine caused motion and path in the semantics of a single verb. Some languages don't even like it in the same clause. So that's interesting to find that in the gesture as well. We also found that the meaning component per gesture ratio is much higher under condition 3. If we then look at the language comparison, again, overall, we have some shared trends. The relative number of gestures captured is the same for the different languages. So condition 1 is all gestures. The next highest would be, condition 1 is all. The next highest is condition 4, then condition 2, and then condition 3. So the caused motion, the semantic definition, grabbed the fewest, but that was because of the semantic component we chose, right? If you choose path or as a semantic component, that might look very different. So broad similarities in the relative number of meanings captured. That's noteworthy in itself that condition 1, 2, and 4 are similar because we have quite small data sets. So any difference in sampling relating to text types, demographics, people, could have a quite big effect. So the fact that we find this similarity is actually quite interesting. But we also find language-specific differences. We find the English speakers compared to the Oceanic language speakers. English speakers are less likely to align their gestures with the main verb. They're less likely to depict caused motion in their gestures. And they're less likely to align the gestures with co-expressive speech compared to the Oceanic speakers. So in conclusion, we could say the choice between condition 1, 2, and 4 is relatively little impact in terms of the semantic profile of what we get in our data sample. So we could say we can consider results from methodologically different studies using these different conditions without comparing apples with oranges. So we can draw on studies that use these different definitions and compare major trends. That seems to be unproblematic. Studies that use condition 3, so semantically defined inclusion of gesture, had a very different set of results. So we have to be quite careful there. And we found specific language-specific differences very clearly throughout the data, which means we have to be very cautious before we take findings from one language, say English, or even a few languages, say a bunch of European and Asian languages, as representative of the languages of the world. So that's really important. So I want to end on this, the importance of including typologically diverse languages and the importance of documenting endangered languages and knowing about what's out there in the diversity of human language rather than restricting ourselves to a small data set. And this is it. Thank you very much. And I briefly go to my references just because you're recording this. This should obviously be part of it. Thank you.
So, Anna, thank you very much. I'm actually going to stop the recording here so people can feel